Good evening to you all. Our respected Vice Chancellor Sir, Dean Faculty of Arts, our guest speaker, and dear friends, Deans of Faculties, administrative staff, students, and well-wishers. I have great pleasure to welcome you to this occasion of Prof.S. Krishnarajah Memorial Lecture today. First, we will light a traditional oil lamp. I kindly request our Vice Chancellor, Prof.S.Krishnarajah, and our Prof.S. Raghuram, Dean, Faculty of Arts, and our guest speaker, Dr. Janice Liasco, Associate Professor, College of Liberal Arts, University of Texas, Austin, USA, to light the traditional oil lamp. Thank you, sir and madam. Our University of Jaffna was established in 6th of October 1974 and celebrating its Golden Jubilee celebrations during this year. As such, we are celebrating the commemoration of Prof.S. Krishnarajah today. First, I kindly invite our Vice Chancellor, Prof.S. Krishnarajah, to deliver the welcome speech and introductory speech.
While paying the respectful obeisance to Almighty Lord, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome all the participants to this 14th year commemoration of late Professor Krishnarajah, who was the eminent professor in philosophy and the dean of the faculty of this university. Professor Krishnarajah, born in Nuremberg on the 2nd February 1947, and had his school education in the Jaffna Iskandavarodya College, Kandarode. He entered the University of Peradeniya in 1967 and awarded the Bachelor of Arts Special Degree in Philosophy in 1970. He joined the University of Peradeniya as a temporary assistant lecturer in 1971 and served there up to 1975. Later, he joined the University of Kelaniya in 1976 as assistant lecturer and served a year period. During this period, he completed a Master of Arts degree in philosophy in the research title Conceptual Analysis and Political Philosophy. Professor Krishnarajah joined the University of Jaffna in 1976 as an assistant lecturer and served here until his untimely demise on the 29th May 2009. He was the head of the Department of Philosophy and promoted as a senior lecturer in 1983 and associate professor in 1998, and later as a professor in philosophy in 2001. During this period, he served as a visiting professor in philosophy at the University of Eastern Universities of Sri Lanka and Southeastern University of Sri Lanka. During his long period university service, Professor Krishnarajah's valuable contribution to the university academic development is immeasurable and immensely contributed to the development of philosophy both in the Indian and Western contexts. Professor Krishnarajah always impressed others by his scholarship, sound knowledge, and analytical skills in examining philosophical issues. Professor Krishnarajah served in the University of Peradeniya, University of Kelaniya, University of Jaffna, Eastern University of Sri Lanka, and Southeastern University of Sri Lanka during his 40 years university life period. In the University of Jaffna, he decorated the university as an eminent professor in philosophy, head of the Department of Philosophy, dean of the Faculty of Arts, great scholar and good administrator. He also chaired the presidents of the Teachers Association of the University of Jaffna. On the request of family members of Professor Krishnarajah, the Faculty of Arts, University of Jaffna instituted their memorial lecture from 30th May 2011 and consequently conducted every year by the University of Jaffna to commemorate the service of late Professor Krishnarajah. This year we are delighted to have Dr. Yanis Lesoko, Associate Professor at the College of Liberal Arts, University of Texas, Austin, USA, to deliver this memorial oration of late Prof.S.Krishnarajah under the title of Sri Lanka's Impact on Ananda Kumaraswamy's Perspective of Art and Aesthetics. Janice just retired from the combined appointment at the University of Texas at Austin, where she taught for many years in both Asian Studies and Art History departments. During this period, she also held administrative roles such as Director of Graduate Portfolio in Museum Studies and Director of the Center of Asian Studies. Assumptions on the historical significance and artistic output at both Gaya, where the Buddha attained enlightenment, have been the particular focus of her research. Her work as curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art also raised more general concern about how different audiences build their understanding of South Asian art. Institutions which include the American Institute of Sri Lankan Studies, the National Endowment for Humanities, and the American Institute of Indian Studies have awarded her fellowships. Studying Ananda Kumaraswamy's early work was prompted by the recent interest in Sri Lankan art. Janice served as a U.S. chair of committees that oversaw the American Institute of Indian Studies Center of Arts and Archaeology for 12 years. Additionally, she has been elected to a number of roles, including the President of American Council of South Asian Art. In addition to organizing conferences, seminars on the variety of subjects pertaining to India and Sri Lanka, she has pushed to increase the access to archives. Recently, Ethel and Ananda Kumaraswamy's work to make albums of images of Sri Lankan artists and visual work made available. On behalf of the University of Jaffna, I would like to extend our appreciation to Dr. Janice Lesotho for accepting our kind invitation and delivering the late Professor Krishnarajah Memorial Lecture of the year 2024. From her interested field of study and expertise area of research, so we are delighted to listen to her on the title of the talk, Sri Lanka's Impact on Ananda Kumaraswamy's Perspective of Arts and Aesthetic. With the manuscript we have gone through, it is of creating deep thinking, important ideas, and beautiful imagination of Ananda Kumaraswamy's perspective of arts and aesthetic. Once again, I thank Dr. Janice for accepting our invitation. And Madam, is over to you now. Welcome. Thank you.
I call upon Ms. Brunda Kunasingam, lecturer of our university, to garland our guest speaker and to honor her.
The first important thing, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, but particularly those of you there who are students. Thank you for coming to hear about someone from some time ago who remains really important to many people, both here in Sri Lanka, but also in the West. And as somebody coming from America, who worked on South Asia for a very long time with regard to Buddhist material, but having never visited Sri Lanka, my privilege to come here more than a decade ago now opened up another way to think about the importance of us talking to each other. And this really is the theme that I think we celebrate when we look at Kumaraswamy and look at the prolific record that he left for us, to actually, although it's trite to say, are almost like breadcrumbs that we can follow in various ways to begin to think about not only what he achieved, but also what around him reacted both with him and without him. For to actually look at Coomaraswamy's record is, like for all of us, to recognize that we have aspirations, but we are also, obviously, humans with certain difficulties in moving ourselves beyond assumptions we do not realize we have. We are now in a time with the development of art historical questions and the development of religious studies questions, where things that Coomaraswamy was attempting to do reach a more profound level, not simply issues of iconography or issues of aesthetics separate from the role of art in society, but the bringing together of those two streams. And this is, in fact, what has been the engine for me in looking at Coomaraswamy in Sri Lanka. Now, I have a lot of things I could tell you about, but what I'm going to try and highlight today has to some degree been, I suppose, shaped by trying to say why he is important for the West, as he is also important for communities outside the West. In other words, this is an individual whose work and the record of his work that he left us, because he was a prolific writer, as well as somebody who interacted at various levels in important times, allows us all kinds of windows. So instead of having one specific viewpoint, the more Coomaraswamy is worked or thought about, the more that gets opened up. And so I hope to give you a few things to think about with respect to that, and especially to consider the issue of what is aesthetics, a problem that I believe Professor Krishnarajah also dealt with over and over again with students, and how to find the place of aesthetics in the significance of life and social practice. Coomaraswamy lived in an amazing time, especially in the moment in which he spent here in Sri Lanka for a period of four years. I assume everyone is aware of the fact that although he was born in Sri Lanka, by the time he was 2, his father had died, and he was back in England with his mother, with his English mother, and he was raised within England in an English education, coming back to Sri Lanka only when he was 25 to head a newly formed survey of mineralogical study. For Coomaraswamy began at a level that was very high, but it was a level that did not embrace directly the humanities that occupy so much of what we think about him. He was trained as a scientist, specifically as a mineralogical investigator. And this is what he came to Sri Lanka as an employee for the empire. Now, oops, I have lost my text. I'm going to read this in part, but also try and be somewhat impromptu in giving you things to think about with the images. And I begin with, first of all, having you look at this photograph, which was taken in 1916, which as an art historian, I have given you the name of the photographer, who is a man who is involved in a particular group of artists and people involved in literature that was very much on an avant-garde, on a forward-looking, where is the world going perspective. When we realize that Coomaraswamy, at the moment in which he is about to take up his position in America at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, this is where he is. He is an individual who is plugged into a variety of networks, that alone has only just recently, let's say within the last 15 years, begun to really be taken seriously by those who work in the West in this important period of modernism and the early 20th century. But he was a man, as you can see, who has presented himself as an individual who is both in the East and in the West. And that's what I will try today to toggle between, as I also toggle between the images. When we think of Coomaraswamy, he is often singularly presented, as if those around him did not figure in except as conversationalists. And yet the collaborators, including his 4 wives and his various friends and collaborators in writing projects, were very much central to the ways in which he developed his own scholarship. So once again, when we begin to think about all of the various threads or breadcrumbs that can be studied, his life is a complex mix of various influences. But it's also a complex of influences that have much to do with the time, which is a chaotic moment. In the years that are leading to the Great War, World War I, we have major upheavals in the passing of certain kings, as well as certain other rulers, such as the Dalai Lama, who has to flee Tibet for a period of time. And in the second decade, we have China falling apart. This is where he is living, as we now understand, with our own world of chaos. Coomaraswamy, for the 4 years that he was here in Sri Lanka, was busy looking into mineralogical excavations or identifications and sending samples regularly back to England. He was a man employed by the empire, and the empire was looking for economic advantage. They were looking for mineral resources that could be exploited. This alone gives us a great deal to think about, another subject I won't deal with here, but is really one of the parts that clearly affects him in his time in Sri Lanka, as he is also moving in other circles. But it is important to remember that his mineralogical work was something that was directed by those in England. His high-level writing about geological forms, the discovery of thorionite, are all incredible, important events. But it was not something that he was on his own developing. At the same time that he worked in this way for the empire, he was also, with his wife, Ethel Coomaraswamy, involved in a rather detailed and consuming study of the arts and crafts of Sri Lanka, and in particular highlighting those of the Kandyan area. We know this best, and I think this particular book is well known here, the Medieval Sinhalese Art, which is his first book, produced in 1908, actually after he has left Sri Lanka. You see on the screen the only 2 of the many, I think it's over 250 plates of medieval Sinhalese art that are typically presenting the objects of various media that have been gathered and sorted and studied by Ananda and Ethel Coomaraswamy. There is much that I was amazed to find in terms of the research that Coomaraswamy did on these objects that actually are akin to the kinds of work and study that are involved in mineralogy. Mineralogy, it was a new field of study for the world. There was much that was happening in the 19th century in terms of science. And mineralogists, unlike those who worked in the lab, were what we call field scientists. And anyone who has worked in art history knows that one of the important things one needs to do is to go see the actual objects of one's study. But beyond that, the ways in which these objects are studied, the analysis of the appearance, the selection and understanding of the work that you're studying, as well as actually taking samples, are all rather similar to art historical process. It's something that I had not realized about what really set up or used a kind of foundation for his move from science to cultural concerns. In addition to studying the objects, however, and I think everyone may be aware of this, for Ananda Coomaraswamy and Ethel Coomaraswamy, an important aspect of their study was what the artisans, the makers of these objects did. In other words, it is not just the photographs, it is not the end result that is important, but understanding the processes and the techniques that are used in order to unravel the character of the objects and ultimately to form a set of criteria that would develop the ability for judgment or assessing quality. And it is this notion of assessing quality that actually I have found and sort of developed in the work that I have more fully sort of been led to with regard to the way in which he developed a canon of art. Now that's not the primary topic for today, but I want to at least mention that this has a real sort of overlap with thinking about the process and the procedures of studying works, visual works. And it was something that inflected the way they began to understand the importance of breaking away from, let's say, the division of fine arts and craft, something that very much in the West, unfortunately, had caused a sort of cleavage between the way in which we categorized or understood looking at art and giving value to art. Something that we very much today, unfortunately, throughout the world, still struggle with. And we can see that in the way of valuation to some degree, but especially the way in which, for instance, museums organize and present works of art. It is his transformation after working in Sri Lanka for 4 years that became a kind of focus for me in order to understand what happened here in his study of the mineralogy and the arts and crafts, as well as the social experience as he moved through the country, which was amazing in terms of the amount of travel that he did in those 4 years. But he was, and again want to emphasize this, in some ways like many other young people in their 20s at that time who were looking for answers, for changes, ways to make a new order or to develop a new order and way of life. And I think sometimes Coomaraswamy has been looked at too broadly, not in terms of specific moments, so that those sense of change is lost. This has also hampered understanding how he himself developed different ideas and actually changed from sometimes more open ideas to more specific concerns. Now, the last thing I want to say about the moment in which he worked, in addition to the politics of the time, of the early 20th century, full of upheaval but also amazing developments, there were amazing cultural changes. And in the West, that which I can speak about the best, there were all kinds of new initiatives and innovations that were not simply forward and separate from the rest of the world, but actually were heavily influenced by the East, or by South Asia as well as East Asia. In other words, it's actually really difficult for us to talk about Western perspectives or Eastern perspectives. The material that was used by Stravinsky was in fact material that incorporated a high level of interest in non-Western traditions. And it's the celebration of that interest, as opposed to coming up with singly something totally new, that we can see in the way in which someone like Kumaraswamy was so appreciated in terms of his own search to find new versions of that which had been what is sometimes referred to in a despairing manner, traditional. I began my study of Kumaraswamy over 10 years ago with what I thought was a simple question. What is in medieval Sinhalese art? This book from 1908. And I began to find that that was a really stupidly complex question to begin with. As others have found also, that book is an amazing compilation of many things. For me, I was quite surprised to find the degree of Buddhist material that is presented by Kumaraswamy, for in fact, there is very little straightforward, what we would call Buddhist imagery. There are almost hardly any Buddha images represented in it. It is, again, arts and crafts material. The Buddha images are usually talked about in terms of narratives. But in fact, there is a broad, sort of wide, sweeping range of looking at the social context in which this work was produced. And he admits and says in the foreword, without the impetus of the Buddhist tradition, as he is looking at Kandyan material primarily, there would likely have been far less for him to talk about visually or artistically. So there is an important takeaway right there at the very get-go in his foreword, that religion is not the dominant factor, but it is an engine. It is that which gives rise to some of the impulses that we call some of our most important concerns in the production of visual works. Not because of purposes of, let's say, social advancement or even spiritual advancement, but because it is through the practice of making works of art that our lives become somewhat different or enhanced. Nonetheless, in this book, the greatest amount of attention, the thing that I think overwhelms everyone most often, is the degree of information about actual practice of artists. Over and over again, the detail is quite amazing. Now, the book itself, even though it is full of many images, has many more images behind it. Like his mineralogical studies, these works that he chose for this book are based a selection on many more that he had put together with his wife, who was in fact the one who took most of the photographs, if not all of them, and many of the notes for the analysis. Although he is the sole author, she is very much his collaborator, far more than simply the contributing photographer. And this is one of the cautionary elements. It is simply a matter of the time in which women worked with their husbands, but it is something that we ourselves today in 2024 can change in the way that we talk about the ways things are produced, when we can document how people are changed by those around them. Ananda Kumaraswamy is certainly one of those in his work in Sri Lanka with Atal Kumaraswamy. Ethel Kumaraswamy was not only important in his work for the Arts and Crafts project that they engaged in, but she also worked in terms of his mineralogical studies. We see this in the photographs that are credited to her in the official reports. And as I looked back in earlier times, the years before they went to Sri Lanka, she was fully involved in his geological studies in England, and herself taking and writing about samples in geology. And we all, I think, have had partners to which we are involved in their work as well in different kinds of ways. We can understand this. And we can understand that, in fact, there's a richer view when we allow the world to open up. Ethel Kumaraswamy is an accomplished photographer. Ananda Kumaraswamy himself is also rather a good photographer, better than people realize. He was involved in taking images as early as 1900. That's as far back as I've been able to find. But she was incredibly careful in the delineation and construction of her compositions, as you see here in the image of a moonstone excavation near Ratnapura. The only kind of mineral that is actually identifiable and can be mined. All other minerals were found in the Ilam, and they were not actually easily located as far as their source. But she also took notes in his activities, including notes, as we have here, for the production of iron and steel. And so to say that Ethel Kumaraswamy was the photographer gives short shrift, obviously, to her involvement, and also allows us maybe not to think as fully about what led Ananda Kumaraswamy to new approaches in terms of his life. Ethel Kumaraswamy was heavily involved in the arts and crafts movement. Her own brother was a jeweler in England in arts and crafts. And it is clearly the influence of some of these individuals in terms of thinking and experience that are part of what develops Ananda's interest in moving out of science. I began to see that Sri Lanka had a variety of influences when I finally understood his writing for his scientific aspects as sort of interlaced with this activity of arts and crafts. And one example is here at the St. Louis Fair. In 1904 in America, he was tasked, and this is clearly right at the beginning of his time in Sri Lanka, because he did this work in 1903 to be ready for the fair, with producing an exhibit of minerals for the Sri Lankan fair and producing essays for the handbook that was developed. He would go on to participate in other kinds of events like this that interestingly developed in not just mineralogical presentations, as we have here, but actually presentations of arts and crafts. So one of the interesting stories for me that I could recover is the way in which he is able to turn to making presentations of craftsmen at expositions in Sri Lanka, as well as outside, that are similar to ones that originally developed, if you know this history, from the great expositions of Europe. But while he is working on the issues of arts and crafts, he has also turned at the very early date to much larger debates in the discussion of South Asian art. And one of these, which has coalesced into the idea of the origin of the Buddha image, which most art history students now labor on at some point in their careers as undergraduates or graduate students. But it was actually a much larger problem. It had to do with the asserting or determining whether or not India or South Asia, Sri Lanka at this point was often identified as part of India, whether India had any fine art. And there was a vociferous, heated debate among different individuals protesting against the possibility that fine art could be produced in India. Well, the problems are well documented by many scholars today, that often this debate had much to do with a kind of simplistic version of what art was by usually Westerners. But Kumaraswamy took this issue as one of the earliest that became kind of significant point for him. And he took it in terms of this question of the origin of the Buddha image. To see it only as a question about the origin, like whether the origin is in Gandhara, that is the figure on the left, which has heavily Roman or Greek elements in the formation of the style, or Indian, as you see in the figure on the right, is much more seemingly lacking that Hellenistic or Roman elements in the treatment of drapery folds or the treatment of the figure's face. If you make it only an issue about the origin of the Buddha image, you lessen the impact of what that argument, what those debates were about. So going back to thinking of this time and thinking of how Kumaraswamy in some of his earliest writing, even at the time almost leaving, just as he's leaving Sri Lanka on cultural issues, is engaging with this concern. Because in medieval Sinhalese art, we can find one essay is part of an appendix in this volume, an essay that seemingly has nothing much to do with medieval Sinhalese art or arts and crafts. So trying to understand the way in which the book is put together, its construction, and what it's reflecting about his own development is, I think, another sort of breadcrumb that is being developed and mined very usefully by a number of art historians and can still be thought of in larger ways here in Sri Lanka. And one of the most important aspects of thinking of this, that is his turn to looking at questions of Indian arts, is the realization I had that in addition to collecting arts and crafts of Sri Lanka, while he was here for 4 years, he collected 3 small bronzes in Sri Lanka. These bronzes, and this is his favorite by far, when he published over and over again, and it is about 4 inches in height, is by far his favorite and what he determines as one of the most important bronzes of Sri Lanka. Now, its small size may deny that kind of high level, but he argued for what it represented in terms of artistic achievement. In other words, the very heart of how we judge the quality of the work and determine what it reflects about the person, the artisan or artist that has made it, was at the heart of his early investigations. This work and his other 2 Buddhist images that he collected from Sri Lanka are not represented in medieval Sinhalese art, a book that was published in 1909. They are instead first discussed in an article in 1909 or 1908 was medieval Sinhalese art. These are discussed in 1909, and then almost yearly after that until 1917, when they are part of works that are purchased by a trustee of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and then gifted to the museum thereafter. And this is where this image today resides. These works I would call a kind of foundation of the canon that he begins to build in his repetition of representing them and his exploration of what they themselves exude or express in terms of aesthetic and religious form. Because religion is also something that Ananda Coomaraswamy, at an early time, as he moves away from science, chooses to investigate and to hold as a really significant threat. His interest in religion is one of expressing the spiritual quality in a work of art, as well as the artist's involvement in creating that spiritual quality. His interest is not one of an anthropologist, we would say, of one who is interested in ritual. And there's very little discussion ever of ritual activity. In fact, if there is one particular hole in his sort of approach to material, I would say for me, it is the way in which ritual was not something that he engaged. This probably has much to do with his own upbringing and the sign of the times, that in scholarship, ritual at that moment, for people interested in art, in issues of aesthetics, were not looking at what people did with images. That was a matter of anthropology, if at all. Now today we're in a much better place. We understand that a significant part of what we can realize about a work's power, about a work's significance, has to do with who used it and how it was used. But these were not the questions of the early 20th century. And so we cannot fault him for these questions, but we have to, at the same time, recognize the silences and what that has done. There are various things that his inability to approach ritual or certain aspects of religious activity did to the ways in which he engaged with art. One of those, very sadly, has to do with the way in which he looked at art by those in South Asia who produced, if not religious imagery, at least religious themes. These artists, and Nandalal Bose is a very famous artist from Calcutta, an example, were artists who were interested in moving into new areas of expression and were using traditional subjects, but attempting to present them in new ways. At first, Ananda Coomaraswamy, who spends time with Bose and his mentors, the Tagores in Calcutta, is very much in the circle of promoting their work. But by the let's say 1915, he seems to have turned against these kinds of representations because they are not traditional and they are in some way inferior by their simple contemporaneity. So when these works were used by Coomaraswamy, whereas they were used in 1910 in a book that he finished for Sister Nivedita, who died before she could complete a book on myths of Hindus and Buddhists, the works apparently needed to be used again by the same publisher, and he was regretful and wrote about that they actually were used, unfortunately, I think is the way he put it, in a letter to a close friend, and were unfortunate works. So from 1915 and afterwards, these artists, these what we would say are contemporary artists, are no longer in the purview of what Ananda Coomaraswamy is discussing. Another incredible silence is his engagement for late images that he saw all over Sri Lanka in his time here. These images, such as we see here at Degaldaru, this very large Buddha, which is admittedly more recently painted from its 18th century original form, is nonetheless still an imposing work in an imposing cave excavation in the region of Kandy. It is a work that, or a site, that Kumaraswamy went to various times, that he actually talked about, but he talked only about the painting. He never illustrated the sculptures. In other words, he never illustrated the focus of devotion at these places of devotion. This is, again, a lacuna or a short view of how he was looking to evaluate art. It is not unusual at the time, nor is it even that unusual still today, although there's much better sort of coverage of these late images here in Sri Lanka, but in many places in the world, contemporary or recent religious imagery is not a highlight of people who are looking at arts. And yet we have to recognize that this is a bias that keeps us from thinking about the kinds of developments that produced in the past what we call incredible, sometimes, achievements or miracles. I have just lost. So the ways in which my study proceeded was not to only try and look for silences, but I tried to be balanced in seeing the significance of his interests and abilities, which were many, along with what are a lack of imagery of a kind. In some ways, medieval Sinhalese arts, although there are many other works to look at, continues to be, I think, the best source, not the only source, but the best source for us to understand a kind of coalescence of his interest about Sri Lanka. And for me, in some ways, what is called the press mark that appears in the last page of the first edition of medieval Sinhalese art is really very compelling in its imagery. The press mark, as we see here, is designed to highlight the source of the book. That's what press marks do. It was designed by his friend Charles Ashby, and it is only found in the first edition, which is an important thing to recognize. The interest of what Kumaraswamy was trying to do with medieval Sinhalese art is, I think, wonderfully called out by Ashby's design. So this is Ashby making this design for his friend. Ashby was a close friend of Ananda, but also even more fully a close friend of Ethel. Again, remembering that this community of individuals in which he worked was something that we should probably pay attention to. Ashby was a socialist activist. He was an architect and a designer, and he formed a guild and a school of handicraft workers in which Kumaraswamy became deeply connected. living nearby, patronizing them, actually having works produced by them, and often hosting events for them. For the guild, often had lectures for the group, or held lectures for the community and those around them, as well as various other kind of events. The confluence of arts and crafts, of social and cultural issues, was certainly an informative influence on Coomaraswamy in terms of what he developed as he looked at material here in Sri Lanka, and in his first steps in developing a canon of art, that is fine art, and what he called fine art after he left Sri Lanka. The press marks design is really interesting. It's useful to spend a moment to see that the central flowering tree in which a naked couple sit, holding baskets and searching for blooms, are a kind of presentation in the tree. There are smaller trees flanking the main one, and the sky is studded with these glowing flowers. The trees are positioned on a pedestal on which the words Norman Chapel and Broadcampton are written. Norman Chapel is the name of the house that the Coomaraswamies lived in. Broadcampton is the town, or the small town. We see his initials, AKC, and the year of the book, 1908, in the trunk of the tree. The banner on each side, Kelmscott and Essex House, represent the two names of the press, which was given a certain identity then to the various publications produced on the printing press that Coomaraswamy used. The printing press itself is an incredibly interesting sort of lineage, because Kelmscott was the press of somebody named William Morris, an important social activist and artist and writer. William Morris decided near the end of his life to also open up printing, to create by modern means beautiful books. So no longer were books produced by hand as medieval artists had, but they were instead still highly and carefully produced by artisans, to use modern means to produce books. And they are, some of them are recognized as the most beautiful books produced in the 19th century. Morris, when he died, left the press for sale, and Ashby took over the press and decided himself to take on that new role, to produce books. This unfortunately failed, and Ashby had to give up producing books, leaving the press open for Ananda Coomaraswamy in 1908, really 1907, to use that press in his nearby house. And it is in this way that Kelmscott and Essex House being the name of Ashby's press, that this is then a kind of lineage presented, giving rise to anyone who would know that this is a very particular kind of publication. This is one in which espouses not only the artistic elements, but also the social concerns that are identified by Morris. This is a part of Morris's legacy, and also Ashby, that is sometimes not highlighted enough. And it's something that Coomaraswamy's time here in Sri Lanka, in a variety of ways that I can't talk about today for lack of time, but is highlighted by the kinds of activities that he and his wife were involved in. That is, in education activities, where they gave lectures and other sorts of events to develop social practice that combined also kind of activity of the arts. So the arts are not off in a small closet. Art is part of what makes, in a sense, the engine for not just changing the world, but developing it in its best form. What is particularly interesting about the press mark, which appears again only in the first edition, and the first edition of medieval Sinhalese art was unfortunately limited to 425 copies. So if you've seen a copy of medieval Sinhalese art, you have probably seen a later one. There was a second edition produced in 1956, and since then many later printings. Those don't include this press mark. But we can see in the press mark something even more, I suppose, interesting in the way in which it actually is mirroring, and you may have recognized this already, a Kandian design. The tree motif that Ashby has highlighted here is actually drawn from a specific tree, from a specific Kandian wall painting that was recorded in a painting made by Ananda Kumaraswamy. You are seeing a copy of that painting on the right that appeared in medieval Sinhalese art. So we are looking here at two copies by two men of a Buddhist design from the 18th century. Their various versions of the wall painting are done for different reasons. But it is interesting to think about the possibility of their discussions, and most certainly there were discussions, about these forms as Ashby decides and settles on the way in which he is going to make the press mark. And the discussions of those forms are not simply as arts and crafts works or works of Buddhist art, but of both, let's say, of things that herald a kind of development of importance. The press mark is not the only way in which we can think about the variety of influences that appear in medieval Sinhalese art. Again, my particular interest with Buddhist tradition, so that's what you're getting here. But there's one that's incredibly interesting because it seems to have been especially that which changed the way in how Kumaraswamy looked at the art of the past. It has to do with his awareness or growing interest in looking at past South Asian arts, and in his recognition that at the site of Bharhut, a site from 2,000 years ago, there were influences that he could draw. He could draw connections between Bharhut and designs in which he saw in Kandy. Here is one example of what he produces in medieval Sinhalese art. Here's the book that he's actually looking at, a book by a very important 19th century archaeologist who did a lot of work on Buddhist Indian sites, named Alexander Cunningham. Bharhut, as you can see, is way far away from Kandy and from Sri Lanka. Bharhut is way far away in chronology and location. And yet Kumaraswamy found at Bharhut, by looking carefully at the plates, because he had not been to the site at this time in 1909, that he saw design motifs in the costumes of the figures who are delineated in the pillars of the Bharhut stupa, that which you see on the left, in the costumes of these dancers, and I'll point it out right here and here. It formed the source of a discussion, a paper that he read in 1907 at the Asiatic Society in Colombo. And he was not suggesting a direct link, but was instead suggesting that there was reason to actually look seriously at the motifs of Kandian art for the longevity of style development. That is a kind of shared past. And it is with this realization that he then begins to look more carefully at much earlier art. So it seems to me that this is one of those moments that brought him into thinking about the value of looking at the past and the value of talking about it. For in the work of William Morris and Charles Ashby, an important part of activity was the way in which you could share the understanding of the past, not just as something to look at and visit as a tourist, but to understand the attitudes of past society and the place of art in past society. And for Ashby, the most important, and he passed this influence also on to Kumaraswamy, it seems, the most important focus of past artistic practice was located in the development of architecture. For the development of architectural form begat or inspired the need for architectural decoration, for sculptural decoration, for painted decoration, for furnishings, for the architecture. If architecture is denied or not patronized, as he was beginning to see happen in the case in Sri Lanka, then it would, to some degree, strangle the little bit of tradition that was still being allowed to be developed by in Sri Lanka. So at this moment, about 1906, it seems as Kumaraswamy turns down reappointment for a second term as the director of the survey, he has made his decision to move into the development of understanding. And it is with that decision, I think, of 1906, that he coalesces the ideas that he and Ethel have already been working at in terms of developing the arts and crafts material. And it is in that book, which he then produces a year later in 1908, after they leave, that serve as a kind of basis for his attitude about the importance of art. But it is, again, also, I like to think of it as a second stream, something that is happening while he is seeing the significance of religion and religious practice, even as he does not actually document it in the island itself. And it is in the acquiring of past objects, like the Buddhist bronzes that I showed you in the Avalokiteshvara, that begin to, in a sense, lead him to think about the way in which to develop an argument about the importance of fine arts in South Asia. And again, for him, South Asia included, that is, India included Sri Lanka at this point. The importance of fine art in the past for Sri Lanka that was preserved at later times, as in the Kandian material, even in what was called arts and crafts. This then goes on into a further development of stories about the ways in which he chose to emphasize certain kinds of sculpture and certain kinds of paintings. But the basis is here in his careful looking at material, the geological or mineralogical material, as well as the arts and crafts material of Sri Lanka, married, if we would like to think of it that way, with ideas that have influenced his thinking about the role and importance of arts as part of social concern from people like Ashby, who are continuing ideas of Morris. And it's that which he takes back to England and then onward in his further development, where he begins to collect seriously and write seriously about fine arts. And with that, I'll stop and say, I hope this has been somewhat interesting.
Today the speaker, Dr. Jenny Leoshko, the Associate Professor, College of Liberal Arts, University of Texas, Austin, USA, and professors, lecturers, head of the departments, and the well-wishers. Good afternoon to you all. Really, this is the high time to listen the mesmerizing architect of the Sri Lankan art and appreciation. So we are very much thankful to you, Janice, for delivering a very mesmerized speech on the memory of Professor Somasundaram Krishnarajah. The university is very thankful to you, although we are coming from USA and take part in the historical event. And thank you very much for the audiences, very patiently listen and got the inputs of the great speech here. So thank you very much on behalf of the University of Jaffna. So this is the Golden Jubilee year. So we are celebrating the series of events of Golden Jubilee celebrations. So this is one of them. So thank you very much again to you all and have a nice day today. Thank you very much.